When it comes to deploying nodes and networks for our Corda architecture, it's really important to grasp the different types of nodes available and also how we can deploy the network. When it comes to Corda nodes, it's important to know that at its simplest level, a Corda node is nothing more than a Java virtual machine. Now, we could deploy a JVM with specific types of services that are running. So we could deploy, for example, in our Corda network, it could be for membership services. It could be a notary. It could be for whatever type of service we are deploying. And because of that, we want to be aware of the functionality that we could add as part of our core DApp development. Nodes basically are going to interact with basically other nodes. And we already know that the nodes are going to communicate via effectively peer-to-peer networking. Now, the Corda networks is really what is going to enable the interoperability, the communications between our Corda networks. And we could have one or many. And again, we have that capability to collaborate with different consortiums, different institutions if we want. When it comes to node services, we want to be aware that the services we deploy on the node could be different. We may have one node be a scheduler. The scheduler is going to do what? It's going to schedule very specific operations at a specific point in time. Now, that could be anything from going out there and updating our basically key management. It could be going out and grabbing something outside of the blockchain through an oracle, whatever we want to set up and integrate into our blockchain network, that would be fine. Then we have the network map. This is basically an address book. Similar, you could think about this similar to a degree as similar to DNS, right? We need to be able to figure out who is who, where they are, how do we communicate with the different nodes. A notary, this is what's going to effectively obtain authorized signatures and basically validate that the transaction is valid. And we'll talk more about a notary here coming up. And then we have messaging. So this service, again, is a service that is effectively going to communicate with other nodes. This is really where the peer-to-peer communication occurs. Now, when it comes to different types of nodes, there's really 4 specific types of Corda nodes. We have the network map node. This is similar to DNS. Effectively, in the world of IT networking, we need to look up and figure out who is who, where to get to what website. Same thing in a Corda network, except for that we need to figure out how to get from one node to another. Now, a notary, this is a different kind of concept compared to other blockchains. Now, a notary is effectively going to be a component in the blockchain that we're going to deploy to provide some kind of uniqueness to avoid effectively double spending. When it comes to oracles, this is a network service that is going to link our Corda network to the outside world. Let's say, for example, that we need to interface with a third-party application to convert, for example, an authorization to a, let's say, cryptocurrency. Could be any kind of cryptocurrency. Corda does not support natively cryptocurrencies. However, that doesn't mean that we can't integrate, for example, a conversion from an exchange to, let's say, Bitcoin or to Ethereum or whatever. For whatever reason, our application we're running wants to do that. Could also be just to go out and get a stock ticker price. Or in the world of typical interbank requirements, it could be anything from understanding the price of specific treasuries or bonds. Whatever that requirement is, we could tie that in through an oracle, especially, of course, if it's not on the Corda network. Now, we have a regular node. This is basically our typical day-to-day nodes that's going to maintain a vault and have all the communication protocols needed to sort of bring together the network. Now, one of the things to keep in mind as well, that when we deploy a node, we know that it's a JVM basically that's going to have effectively a unique identity. It's going to be running the Corda blockchain software, the peer-to-peer protocol. It's going to have a DApp on it. And this node is going to have interfaces as well. And we typically would have either a network layer and also an RPC base layer. So we're going to have those two interfaces that we'll want to be aware of. I'm going to talk more about that in the development section. Basically, again, we can take the node and integrate it into our network in whatever manner is appropriate. And very simply, we already know that a node is nothing more than a JVM, a runtime environment. It's going to run on our network and is going to have what? Very specific services. Now, when it comes to Corda networks, we need to be aware that the Corda network is really similar to a graph. Now, when I get to the whiteboard coming up, I'll discuss how the network goes together, how the nodes play in. I'll talk about some components that are really critical to understand, such as a service hub, and also to how the clients interact through basically an RPC protocol. When it comes to the Corda network, there isn't a global broadcast. Now, this is different, for example, as opposed to Ethereum. When there's an update to one node in Ethereum, they all get propagated to every other node. Well, in Corda, this is a little different. This is basically a targeted broadcast. So if there's only the need for that broadcast to be sent, it'll be sent to another node. If there isn't a need, it won't be sent. More on this later. Then, when it comes to connections, it's going to be, of course, point-to-point. And these connections are not persistent. In other words, once they're connected, pretty much it's terminated after that. There's no memory of it or any kind of cache per se. Also supports AMQP 1.0 over TLS. Again, this is a secure protocol for connecting. Now, the network is, again, very simply nothing more than a bunch of Corda nodes deployed. That really is what a Corda network is at a high level. Basically, we're going to have nodes running, and we're going to have a map service, of course. We need to have some way to find each other. We're going to have a notary and different types of nodes in the network. So basically, these nodes communicate using persistent protocols. So basically, these protocols are in place in order to create and validate the transactions. But again, the non-persistence comes in after it connects. It then disconnects. And again, there's a little bit more to this discussion. We'll touch on this in the development section a little bit more. But just be aware that we're going to use peer-to-peer protocols with both persistent and non-persistent protocols and capacity. And that also is, again, going to fall into our core DApp design. We're going to have different states, flows to set up, etc. Now, when it comes to the business network, now there's another term that's used to define a specific type of Corda network. And we could specifically define a business network really as a higher level concept. And what this really means is that it's still a Corda network, but they're going to have a very specific governance structure, a very specific rule set, very specific whitelist. In other words, we're going to connect, for example, our Corda network to collaborate, to ensure that different members of the consortium are basically under, a governance structure, very simply. So, for example, when we connect up, different let's say, central banks, of course, all the central banks will have governance structures in place. If we're going to use our core network for transferring some value, let's say, then we're going to have governance in place. That really is all the business network means. It's just that this is a network for specific use cases. Another way I think we could look at it. Lastly, we want to look at notaries before we close out this specific lesson. In Corda, there's a concept of a notary. Now, we could deploy a notary, which is what? Nothing more than a notary node. So it's a node running notary services. It is pretty much what it sounds like. Now, at least in the Western world, typically a notary is going to be, let's say it's a person. This person is going to look at documents, look at your ID, and validate that you are you, or validate your documentation and say, well, this looks like it's valid, and I'm going to attest that it is valid. Well, in the world of Corda, we have something similar. It is called a notary, and it's going to attest to uniqueness. In other words, the notary is going to not only attest to uniqueness, but it's going to be the final point. In other words, it's going to say it's valid or it's not valid. Uniqueness consensus services basically are used to attest to the state that is consumed by a given transaction or has been previously consumed, for example. What this really means, for short, is that because the notary said the transaction was valid, it's considered valid, very simply. When it comes to notaries, they're not always required to attest. For example, what it can happen is that the actors in a transaction can also validate this. So with that said, a notary can be deployed, of course, to ensure some kind of uniqueness consensus. And one more thing before we move on is when we deploy a notary, we can have a single node notary, or we could have a high availability notary as well. So there's really two modes. We could deploy a single notary or multiple notaries effectively working together. So the notary workers we're going to deploy are going to be nodes that are going to be in an HA notary state, or mode, I should say. They're going to have different identities, but they're going to share the same notary identity. In other words, it's similar to like saying I'm node A, I'm node B, but we're all part of the same cluster. That really is what it's going to do. Now, there is a state database. This state database is really a logical database that is going to be highly available, and it can be referenced as needed. Now, there's a lot more that goes into notaries. We'll talk about them a little bit more in development and further lessons as well. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson.